Ambassador Hunter, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hunter. Wow, this has been quite a meeting. I think we've heard a lot of very intelligent things said here. The question is whether we can translate it into something, and I was asked to talk about changing the dynamics. I'm not so sure I can do that, but let me give a little bit of a try. First, this is a very important subject, very important meeting that we're having here today, and a very critical time, not just because we're talking about issues of war and peace. After the United States has been involved in the region in one war for now more than 10 years, which we're looking to find a way of disengaging, beginning with the turnover of the active combat role to the people of Afghanistan in 2014, with, I fear, following that, a result similar to what we saw in Vietnam, because I think we'll lose interest in it. In part because Afghanistan is not really in the Central American strategic interest. There are a lot of things in the neighborhood which are, and I think Iran is one of them. Secondly, we've been in Iraq since 2003 in one of the worst strategic miscalculations in all of American history, second perhaps only to abstention from the League of Nations, and we still haven't gotten over the impact, particularly in the Western Alliance, and in perceptions of American capacity to think clearly about our own interest, leaving aside the damage done to the American economy, which is going to have a long time to play out. It's also a critical time because of opportunity costs. Let me just mention two. Number one, in the disengagement from Afghanistan and its potential evolution in a way that it does not become, again, directly or indirectly, a challenge directly to our security, as happened at least in some respect leading up to 9/11. If we're going to see a future in Afghanistan that is not going to see just a return in that direction, we need to involve all the regional powers. I was at a meeting at a fairly senior place 2 days ago in which that point was made. We need all the regional powers involved, and I said, does that include Iran? Oh, absolutely, it does include Iran. I said, well, we're willing to talk with them about Afghanistan. Well, we try, and we meet with them occasionally in international conferences, but nothing formal and nothing really out loud. And oh, by the way, the fact that they denounced the security agreement between us and President Karzai certainly didn't help matters. No sense that there might have been some Iranian perspective in that, but here's an opportunity cost in my judgment, and nobody in the room is better prepared to testify to that than to Ambassador Dobbins, who has spoken very eloquently on various occasions about the role Iran played in 2001 in helping us to overthrow the Taliban. And then we all know what happened when a junior White House speechwriter invented a thing called the axis of evil. The president put on the list, and the possibility of cooperating with Iran and Afghanistan disappeared. And I would argue that we paid a heck of a price for that. Another example of opportunity cost we're going to see this weekend in Chicago, where the NATO summit will take place on Sunday and Monday. And one of the major issues relates to what's called the interim operational capability of missile defense. Well, as many people will tell you, this particular part of the missile defense system is directed against Iran. There's no secret about that. Not an Iranian capability today, but an Iranian capability that might come into being sometime in the future, a marrying of a nuclear weapon, which Iran certainly doesn't have, and a ballistic missile, which it also doesn't have, though it might conceivably have the latter sooner than the former, though putting the two together is a task that very few countries have managed so far to do. But what is the opportunity cost? All right, fine, you can say missile defense costs you a little money, a little bit of tension with the Allies, but the Russians will not be going to Chicago. In fact, a major reason for moving the G8 conference from Chicago to Camp David, in addition to the fear that there will be demonstrations against the G8, the so-called Occupy movement, which anybody had asked me, I could have told them, having myself been in Chicago in 1968 writing speeches for Hubert Humphrey when we had the riots. They're worried because there will be demonstrations even just with the NATO summit, but by God, they would have had a lot of demonstrations with the G8 there, and the most important thing for an administration, this administration, in Chicago is to have it as boring as possible and not to have any demonstrations. The other reason is that it was clear the Russians weren't going to come, and you couldn't have a meeting of the NATO-Russia Council. And you wouldn't want to have a G8 meeting with Putin there. It turns out he's not coming for a reason that may or not be credible about, I got to put my administration together. But the idea of Putin getting out of that meeting and going home wouldn't have been good politics. So you moved the G8 to Camp David. Well, the Russians are playing games up to a point with missile defense, but essentially missile defense we are doing because of concerns about Iran in the future, and not so much our concerns, but the concerns of a country that are close to us. It's an example of domestic politics at work. Let me tell you a little bit about my own history in this. I go back a little ways on Iranian issues, though even as was said earlier, if the issue gets settled, what will happen to the people in the Iranian business? I've also been involved in Arab-Israeli issues since 1967, so my future is secure. So I won't worry about that particular thing. And in fact, I was in charge of Middle East affairs in the National Security Council from 1979 to 1981. Fortunately, I had a deputy, Gary Sick, who had the primary responsibility for the Iranian account, but I was involved. And let me tell you a remarkable thing that happened. In the middle of the hostage crisis, where the United States was under assault, as we felt, and none more than our good friend Bruce Langan is sitting here. Incidentally, if Bruce is prepared to see a different route for dealing with Iran than a lot of people in the U.S. government, if you invoke the concept of blood money, he has the right to pass judgment on it more than any other than about 52 of America's, of compatriots who were prisoners of the Iranians for 444 days. But right in the middle of that, I helped develop a thing called the Carter Doctrine. And let me demystify what the Carter Doctrine said. It said, in effect, not in these words, but in effect, if the Soviet Union follows up on its attack on Afghanistan and attacks Iran, we will go to war to defend Iran. That's what it meant. Now, admittedly, it was under particular circumstances where we didn't want the Soviet Union to miscalculate. But can you imagine that here's a country that is holding our people hostage, and yet we're prepared, the President of the United States, to stand up in front of the Congress and say, I will defend that country. I don't know, maybe there's a precedent for that. If so, I don't know it. Now, I've been asked to say something about how we change the dynamics. I have to say the following. There's nothing we can decide in this room that's going to do that. There's nothing we can decide in this room about the tactics of the talks that are coming up. We just can't do it. One thing we are very good about in the United States government is we do tactics very well. So do lots of other countries. We don't do strategy very well. And in fact, since the early days in the Cold War, we haven't had to. We didn't think we had to. And in fact, since the end of the Cold War, we haven't, in my judgment, done strategy very well in the world in general, except for one extraordinary matter that was put forward by the first of the George Bushes, grand strategy for post-Soviet space and Europe, to create a Europe whole and free and at peace. One of the few times we've come up with a real grand strategy ab initio, and he did it, and we're still trying to implement it. What has to happen has to be done within the United States government. But it will help to have a debate. We are also sometimes good at debates and sometimes not. We did not have a debate in this country, in the public prints, in the media, in the Congress, before we invaded Iraq. It was suppressed. There are a number of people who were put on the blacklist by various media people who are still there. We don't forget forgive people who were right. We have never forgiven a lot of people who were right in Vietnam. I wasn't. I was wrong in Vietnam. I was in favor of the Vietnam War for a long time. I was in the White House as a very junior person on August the 4th, 1964, at the time of the Tonkin Gulf. And we, as a nation, got ourselves involved in Vietnam, and it took a long time to figure out that maybe it wasn't the right thing to do. The same thing with Iraq. We had a wonderful debate on the Iraq War afterwards, when it became legitimate to do so, but not when it might have helped. We're in a similar situation with regard to Iran today. We're not having the great national debate we need to have. You don't see very much. We've already heard some of the media outlets that will not allow certain things to be said. The paper that talks about all the news that fits to print puts on its front page analyses of IAEA deliberations, which are plain fabrications. And people who are involved in those negotiations will say that, but okay. It got to the point, in fact, in which the ombudsman of the New York Times had to take it up himself. He didn't clarify the issue, but at least he printed Mr. Beeman's comments on that particular thing. The issue has to take place within the government because we're in what I call bubble time, treadmill time. We get started down a path, like on Vietnam, like on Iraq, like we are in Iran, and it's very hard to get off it. Now, that makes us an implacable enemy, which can be a great thing. World War II, great thing. Saddam Hussein miscalculated in 1990 when he got our dander up. And I'm sure whoever it was that told him that the American chargé spoke for the United States when she said this was, I give you an amber light, that guy was probably taken out and shot afterwards, but it was too late for Saddam on that particular occasion. But the question is, how do we break the cycle before it's too late? Well, we're not going to do that. That's going to have to happen in the United States government. Now, what do I recommend? What do we need to do? Number one, the President and the Secretary of State need to hire some people who know what they're doing in regard to strategic thinking, in regard to this particular issue. There are a lot of very talented people in the United States government on this issue. Hunter's Rule, having now worked in the White House 5 years, including in charge of 2 of the most important portfolios, Europe and the Middle East under Jimmy Carter, is that whatever you want to know, if you want to call Paul Pillar, for example, about something, everything you need to know on the outside, well, there's somebody who knows it, but you have to do 2 things. First, you have to find Paul Pillar, then you have to listen to him. First is easier than the second. And you have to break through that particular thing, and that requires courage and leadership on the part of a president. Second, and you have to be willing to do it sometimes against incredible odds. No accident that the power of the China lobby was finally broken. The only precedent I can think for what we've been going through in recent years was finally broken when one of the most anti-communist people we had, who ran on red baiting for years, a man named Richard Nixon, understood the strategic importance of an opening to China, which helped us lose a war without paying a heavy political or strategic price. It was a brilliant maneuver, but who else could have done it except Richard Nixon? We need something of the level of courage like that. We don't have a Richard Nixon in the presidency right now because we don't have anybody who's taking that kind of position. Not that I'm arguing in favor of that. We need a qualitative analysis about Iran. We need a qualitative analysis about the region, and it needs to start with the following. What is our basic interest in the region? As a whole, not just 8 different parts in the area between Morocco and the Hindu Kush or beyond, but it's all one in some respects, as we've seen with regard to what they call the Arab Spring and what's happening within individual countries. And it was we've seen with certain kinds of interactions where whatever connection the Arab-Israeli conflict has to what's happening with Iran's happening with terrorism, etc., we can debate that all day. But to say there's no connection is nonsense. Of course there's a connection. The question is how one deals with it. We do not have a process in the U.S. government, and we rarely do, which looks at these strategic elements all together. That's point 1. Point 2, and this goes against conventional wisdom. I think we need to deflate the nuclear issue with Iran. We've already heard arguments earlier today that maybe Iran with the nuclear weapon is something we can deal with, we can live with, maybe. In fact, I would argue up until about a year ago, reading the tea leaves of the U.S. government. I won't even pretend to read the tea leaves in Iran. I won't even pretend to do that. But I can try to read tea leaves here in the United States. The conventional wisdom was moving in the direction of a containment policy, if need be. If the Iranians would go so far as to get the bomb. If they would. Maybe they will, maybe they won't. I don't know. So I will say this. If I wanted to design a policy to drive Iran to get the bomb, I would do exactly what we've been doing the last 10 years. It's amazing that they haven't gone that far. Well, time to change. But I'm not so sure we're going to be able to do so. Whether it's something, whether it becomes something of a terribly import or not, I don't know. I think the Iranians would be crazy, as has already been said, to get the bomb. Even though the lesson of what Gaddafi did, who came to the same conclusion, it's not a great lesson if you're trying to convince Iranians to go in that direction. They'll become more of a pariah. What's one weapon going to do? And if they were to use it, that's the end of Iran. Will other countries in the Middle East get the bomb? Of course not. They'll just cozy up under us even more. And even if they wanted to get the bomb, how many years would it take them? This is all nonsense. So one of the things that does have to happen, and I don't think we can do it, is to get some people to sit down with whoever Iranians you have to and teach them strategy 1, 2. The basic lessons of nuclear policy and deterrence. I grew up as a nuclear strategist, and I could sit down, Jim Dobbins, there are other people in the room, sit down if we had the opportunity with senior Iranians and say, have you really thought about the following kinds of things? Why don't you, here's a little Herman Kahn to read, or a Bernard Brody or something. Is this really what you want to do? And the wise ones would say, it's not such a bright idea anyway. It's a white elephant. White elephant. Okay, the idea of Iran with a nuclear weapon becoming a hegemon in the Persian Gulf. Give me a break. Iran is not a great power, and it's not going to become a great power. It might be the major power in the Middle East, might be a major power in the Middle East. It's not going to be a hegemon unless we are so chucklehead as to depart from the Middle East altogether. Now, a lot of Americans would like to get there and do that, and in fact, the same person the other day, unnamed person in a background interview, said, the tilt to Asia has something to do with being tired of wars in the Middle East and kind of wanting to depreciate what we're doing in the Middle East. I'll let you in on something. We can't leave the Middle East. We're a European power. We're also a Middle East power. We're going to be there. And the Libya thing just underscored, we're going to be there. We have no choice. Frankly, neither do our European allies, but they haven't woken up to that yet, and they kind of like to ignore it. And against that, what's Iran? We have a lot of people who mew and cry about it, and we can sell them a lot of weapons, which are going to be basically useless. They can look to us as security. If I were really worried about Iran in the Persian Gulf, I would worry about Iranian businessmen, Iranian culture, other things. I wouldn't worry about Iranian bombs or this sort of thing. I wouldn't worry about closing the Strait of Hormuz, through which Iran has to. This has just, I think, been grossly inflated. Remember, we are an extraordinarily powerful country. Next layer of analysis, we have to look at this region-wide. Am I allowed to say this? We and the Iranians do have some compatible interests. I've already mentioned Afghanistan. I think if we want to get out, having Iran involved in there, along with the others that are going to be involved, China, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Russia, China, which is going to buy as much of Afghanistan as it possibly can, there are parts of Afghanistan where Iran has certain things that are compatible. The Russians are allowing us to use their territory and contiguous territory to supply folks in Afghanistan, our folks there. And incidentally, the Pakistanis, in order to get invited to Chicago, lifted the barrier on the flow of stuff this morning. That was a pretty good deal. But the Russians are allowing to do this in part because they suffer, number one, in the world from the supply of drugs from Afghanistan, and Iran is number two. When I was in Afghanistan a few years ago, I was told that The Iranians had gone to NATO and said, look, do you mind, pretty please, putting some of your troops on our frontier and a provincial reconstruction team on our frontier? Because we're losing all these people to drug dealers. Most of the NATO countries said yes. The United States said no. Well, there you go, lost opportunity. And also with regard to Iraq, I think the Iranians might like to dominate Iraq. At the same time, I wonder whether the Iranians really would like to see an Iraq which could still go into civil war, etc. Now, these are minor things. Now, wait a second. There are certain more important things. Confidence-building measures. One thing I'd like to see us do. 1972, the height of the Cold War, the U.S. Navy and the Soviet Navy came to an epiphany. What happens if one of our ships run into the other guy's ship? And so we concluded at that time in the Cold War an incidents at sea agreement. Well, I think we should have an incidents at sea agreement with the Iranians. I think we should have a freedom of shipping agreement through the Strait of Hormuz. We already see Iranians cooperating on a tacit basis in counter-piracy. Well, maybe you don't want to keep it on tacit, maybe you want to make it explicit. These are things where we have common interests. Ping-pong diplomacy, whatever it is, these are things that could be done. One final thing I have to say about what we ought to be doing. I'd like to see I think if we were really serious about the negotiations, we just lift the sanctions. You want to influence the Iranian public, get rid of the sanctions. Sanctions do not work. Well, I don't know whether there's a pause for that, but I can't think in all my 50 years in this business, maybe Jim will know someplace, I don't know a single time where sanctions have ever worked. In circumstances where countries see that they have some fundamental interest at heart. Sanctions did not bring down the South African regime. I don't know, but sanctions are a feel-good thing. They're a thing you do where you have to do something for public opinion. You want to show you're doing something, you want to show the Congress you're doing something, and you don't want to go to war. That's why you do sanctions. But if I were somebody in Iran right now and I wanted to have a poisonous relationship with us, I'd be up here working to get more sanctions. And one of the things, if I were the Ayatollah, I'd say, please, please, take the MEK off the terrorism list. If there's anybody who's hated in Iran more than the MEK, I'd like to know who it is. Perhaps somebody can enlighten me on that. That, I think, would be stupid from our part, in addition to immoral. I don't like taking people off a terrorism list that used to kill Americans, but then I'm a patriotic American. But if I really wanted to poison relationships, that's something I'd do. The other thing is, back in the Bush administration, when we were dealing with North Korea, senior leadership, once Condi Rice and once Mr. Richard Armitage said in public, we will not attack North Korea. We won't say that with regard to Iran. We will not say it. I've argued for years, let's make a list. What do we want from Iran? Make the whole list. And say, okay, if you do the whole list, we'll say we won't attack you, we won't give you guarantees, we'll work out, we won't do it. Well, how are you possibly going to disarm your critics if you won't do this? I said not too long ago to somebody who has to remain nameless, but he was a person who represented his government at the talks in Baghdad. And I raised this with him. He said, well, if the Europeans say that security stuff doesn't count. I said, what if the United States were to say it? Oh, he said, that's a game changer. Issue over with. This is one of the negotiators. I can't name the country. It was off the record. You might be able to figure it out. But I think it's, the Europeans, one reason they've been involved in the P5+1, the overriding objective, they tell me, is to keep us from going to war with Iran. Okay, they don't want to get the bomb. Of course they don't want to get the bomb. I don't want them to get the bomb. But by gosh, if you don't want them to do that, you got to start thinking about basic strategic analysis and our interests overall. Now, what do the Iranians have to do? Lots of things. For one thing, which I don't think will happen, is to shut up. Every time Ahmadinejad says, was there a Holocaust? I'm not quite so sure. Every time he gets in trouble, he says that. Or maybe Israel shouldn't exist. He doesn't actually say that. What he says is, why don't we go back to 1947 and start over? Well, if I were an Israeli, I would see that as the same thing. And then we leap out of the water like a largemouth bass, and we snap at it. Okay, well, they got to shut up. Another thing I'd like to see, which I learned from Professor Hunter, if the Iranians really want to change things, they would reconnect with Israel. I remember a time of very profound Israeli-Iranian relations. Oh, I'm sorry, not just under the Shah, at the time of Iran-Contra. A relationship with Iran that was initiated by officials of the Israeli government. That seemed like a good idea at the time. It's about strategic calculation. Why are we only the ones that don't seem to be able to do that? Oh, incidentally, one other thing we need to do, and this will get me in trouble, we need to seize control of the issue back for the United States again. Seize it back again, so we decide these things on the basis of our strategic interest, not in terms of domestic politics. Incidentally, the most important date this year, in terms of preventing war, etc., and maybe having a chance to move forward in the future, was not in Baghdad a few weeks ago. It's not going to be May 23rd. It was March the 5th. When President Obama met with Prime Minister Netanyahu, and along with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and others, allowed Mr. Netanyahu to understand that a war with Iran was unacceptable. Certainly until the 7th of November. Unfortunately, he had to sell that at a high price, which was keeping all options on the table. That's dumb. You don't say that. All options are always on the table. I mean, that's a kind of dumb bluff. Example, in 1998, when Milosevic was doing terrible things with regard to Kosovo, our negotiator, who will remain nameless, blessed memory, convinced the NATO allies to fly the entire NATO air armada to the Serbian frontier and then turn back and come home. I said that was worse than doing nothing. That said bluff. All right, all options on the table. If you don't, then do it. Never pull out the gun unless you're going to shoot. And as soon as you say, you should never say that. I mean, let people understand it. We're a great power. We can calculate our interests. People can try to calculate our particular interests. Well, the way the president sold that, unfortunately, was to take off the table the idea of containment. It is unacceptable. Now, if we are now hostage in terms of American declaratory policy, either to break our word on that or to go to war with Iran, we are hostage to the Iranians not getting a nuclear weapon. A great power should never allow itself to become hostage in that way. Well, the president had to get past the election, so there you are. Final word. Talk. I don't know of any other country in the world that refuses to talk with everybody. The Israelis talk to the Iranians, off in the corner here. As I said, maybe we see some Iranians in conferences, that sort of thing. When back in the, before the Egypt thing, and I used to go to all kinds of conferences, there'd be an Israeli there, an Egyptian there. The first thing they'd go in the corner. The Egyptian military and the Israeli military, therefore, when it came to Camp David, implementing it was a piece of cake because they'd worked it all out years before. Well, this is what we have to talk with the Iranians. We have to get over this thing that somehow talking to somebody confers legitimacy. We're the only country in the world that does that. Now, nothing, hope to God, inshallah, will happen of an untoward nature until after our election. And then whoever's president, and whoever's president's going to face the same agenda, I hope they'll have the smarts to do the analysis, hire the people, and change the perspective so we can get the Iranian situation cut back down to the size it really deserves, which is not the size that we have given it. And then in the fullness of time, the fact that the United States is more popular with the Iranian people than is true in any other Middle East society may come to fruition. Thank you.